Welcome to the AA Public Program. My name is John Palmesino. I'm a tutor here. We are going to have this evening a presentation by 4 recently graduated or about to graduate students of the school. And this is part of a series called, both in a promissory and in a threatening way, What is Next? And today we are going to listen to recent students and actual current students of the school presenting their recent works and their recent ideas on what it means to make work and what it means to work at an age where work is no longer labor, it's just collecting a portfolio in order to acquire a credit to enter a neoliberal age. This is a set of thoughts, a set of inquisitions in what it means to be hospitable in this neoliberal age, and what the home and the notion of hospitality means. And so I hear that I'm not supposed to say that this is an inquiry into new practices, even though I actually do think that what we'll hear today is presentation of what it means to practice, what it means to act. And please join me in welcoming Luis Govella, Alessandro Bava, Octave Perrault, and Fabrizio to this presentation of their work, not as a collective, not as individuals, but as a very strange attempt to exit those 2 forms of work and practice that was set out in the 20th century. They are going to present us tonight, not with a lecture, not even with a presentation of intents, but really with a portfolio, like you do in financial age. Welcome.
Thank you, John, for your introduction. And thanks everyone for coming. So I need to start with making a disclaimer, as John kind of already did, that we don't, I mean, contrary to what the talk was kind of advertised as tonight, we don't call ourselves a collective, or we're not called the AIRBNB Collective, but we are kind of, in the process of defining kind of the format of our collaboration as individuals in a way. So we're going to talk tonight about the AIRBNB Pavilion, which is a project that we started working on sometimes in spring 2014. So as the Venice Biennale was approaching, when we kind of heard the first presentation or the first introduction of what the Biennale was going to be by Rem Koolhaas, we kind of felt kind of the urgency of in some way participating to this event, because we felt that it was going to be a kind of an important moment. And as we kind of all either graduated recently or about to graduate, Louis is a 5th-year student, we kind of felt that we were interested in kind of seeing if there was, what was the possibility for young architects to kind of construct their own agency in a way that was kind of parallel and kind of different from what the kind of traditional way of establishing your practice as a young architect was. So, so the project started really from a name, because we obviously wanted to do something in Venice, but we obviously had like an extreme kind of lack of resources. But paired with that, we had an interest in kind of a contemporary phenomenon, which is the sharing economy, and in particular, AIRBNB, which is in a way a company that, in a way, it's the biggest kind of online company really affects architecture. So we really started with this, the fact that we didn't have any resources to do an exhibition or any kind of event in Venice, and the fact that we were interested in the sharing economy in AIRBNB. So we kind of started from the name, in the sense that we said, like, how do we do a show in Venice not having any money to kind of do it? So we kind of decided to just rent. I mean, the thing started as like, oh, we can rent Airbnb flats in Venice, yeah. So it really started with the name, because traditionally in Venice you have like nation, setting up pavilions. So we kind of had Airbnb and pavilion, very simple, very basic. But the idea kind of grew from that. And so, in a kind of interesting way, the project started very kind of innocently as kind of, oh, we want to do something in Venice, and we want to do something about like a contemporary phenomenon that invests architecture, also because the Biennale was really about fundamentals and this kind of like, beyond history kind of aspects of architecture. So it was not really tackling anything contemporary so much, or that was kind of our understanding of it. So in a way, like, yeah, so it started as a very innocent thing, but then quite soon, kind of the project, we saw that more and more people were interested in this project, and so even it started as a very unofficial thing, but then actually quite soon we started having a kind of correspondence with the Airbnb, the company, and this kind of prompted us to kind of reformulate our agency as young architects vis-a-vis kind of a big Silicon Valley corporation, and that was a very kind of driving aspect of the beginning of this project. I think I'm gonna let Luis kind of explain what the project in Venice was.
Yeah. So the kind of initial, or how the project started, was actually through Airbnb. We kind of needed to find a space to actually inhabit and also have this exhibition set up. So it started through the website. We chose this space that kind of would permit us to kind of exhibit this collection, or we did a curatorial project which we kind of commissioned 25 architects that were showing, we were only showing line drawings from them, and 25 contemporary artists. And they were placed inside the kind of home, but it was a kind of collision between art, architecture, and interior decoration. It was all, the curatorial approach was basically an idea that is kind of an installation or an intervention that does not interfere with the space that's in it already. So what was kind of very relevant for us was the fact that the exhibition was only going to happen in the first 3 days of the opening weekend of the Biennale, but we knew that this kind of, the idea of permanence of this exhibition, we wanted the conversation to kind of go outside of it. So we very early on kind of jumped onto the idea that the online presence of the project was going to be as relevant as the kind of physical, let's say, representation of the project itself. So we started using kind of, our media strategy was very much based on the fact that we needed to create a conversation around contemporary uses of domesticity, and the only way to kind of have an audience nowadays in that respect was through kind of social media in a way. So our kind of Instagram account and our, let's say, Twitter account started becoming like a research-led practice in a way. So we started introducing the themes that we were working with slowly to the audience that we were kind of trying to approach. And this kind of online presence gave this unofficial pavilion, or what started as an unofficial pavilion, a very much official audience around it. It's interesting to point out that the kind of, let's say, confusion around the project between, is it Airbnb, is it like an independent thing, or is it like a pavilion supported by the Biennale itself, generated more conversations around the actual, let's say, pavilion itself. Given so to the point that the New York Times, the only thing that they kind of commented on about the Biennale was the Airbnb Pavilion. Suddenly, this unofficial kind of startup, let's say, exhibition became the kind of face of what people were reading about online in a sense.
So I want to kind of say a couple of words about Airbnb, because I assume that everyone is already using it and is already aware of it, but maybe that's not the case. So Airbnb is defined as an online community marketplace for people to list and book short-term accommodation around the world. And in a way, it's the biggest, with Uber and other companies, is the biggest phenomenon in the so-called sharing economy, which kind of, in a way, is also referred to as one of the biggest companies in the so-called Internet 2.0, which is basically the kind of new wave of companies that really connect the internet with let's say IRL phenomenons in the sense that, like, in a way the web 1.0 would be the one of Google and all the kind of companies that are only purely based online and they have an impact online, but things like Uber and Airbnb have really an impact in real life, because obviously you're renting your home or you're entering someone's car. So in a way it was interesting for us, because we found that we found interesting kind of speculating on the relationship between architecture and the internet, and that is because we found that that relationship has been explored for the past 20 years, but in a way that was always either too metaphorical or too in a way factual, and the fact that a company like Airbnb was actually connecting the real spaces, real architectural spaces with kind of the online community. We found that very stimulating for a project as as young architects trying to kind of have a voice inside this kind of one of the Biennale is kind of the biggest moment for the cultural debate in architecture.
Hello. Yeah. No, I mean, as Alessandro suggested, the AIRBNB Pavilion was also a way to address like a much wider condition of what's going on today on how like these companies are appearing in our everyday life, how they are becoming mediators for many things, from experience, memories, social interactions. Like they become really like the infrastructure for much of everyday life, really. But also, I mean, they start to also, like, using AIRBNB Pavilion as a title in the context of the Biennale, like, as opposed to using the name of a nation, was also questioning the role of the state as, let's say in the modern state, as the infrastructure for identity, but also as infrastructure for surveillance or this kind of dynamics. And yeah, so I mean, Airbnb was it was really a way to see how these companies become interested, like start to invade the role of the state as in terms of managing, but also in producing space, and on the way they start to mediate like the experience of architecture as well on the city. So yes, as Alessandro said as well in the introduction, Airbnb as like the main, or maybe the only and the company, internet company from the sharing economy, which is dealing with architecture as its main content, as its main matter, but also we're interested in it as because it was dealing with the home, the domestic space, and the domestic space as a typology which embodies, I mean, it's always the incarnation of customs, of practices, of habits even, and I mean there's also, I mean, that's the thing that Airbnb was really a case study, a point of entry into addressing these very wide questions that the neoliberal conditions are bringing, which is new forms of labors, financialization, commodification of everything, the shift of a subject as the household or like the individual to like this kind of entrepreneurial subject, mobility, migrancy, all the things that are like very big topics that are very difficult to kind of address as a whole, because we don't really know who we're dealing with anymore, as who we're designing for. All of a sudden, this was just narrowing down to one specific case scenario, let's say. And so, like, I mean, I could keep listing this, like, so the blurriness between what is life, what is work, the general condition of tenancy, tenants, rather than being property owners, but also like. So you have different types of labor. So the sharing economy as a form of, I mean, labor, I guess, but as a form of economy. But I think the home as Airbnb is also addressing things like reproductive labor, the labor happening at home, gender roles. I mean, all of a sudden we could like tap through Airbnb, through the home, we could tap into all these topics in almost a lighter way, in an accessible way, rather than always coming from top down on this. And all this as well through one of the main aspects was the internet and connectivity on this kind of practice. So I guess one of the main questions that came up at the beginning was how Airbnb had this strange quality of not building anything new, but just repurposing architecture. So there was a very strong spatial quality to their to this the effect of Airbnb, and then it brought. I guess the first question we're asking is that, okay, well, Airbnb is supposedly about the home, but what they are really saying is that a room or any one of these spaces can become something between a house, so you can sleep there, but you can also host people, so it has the quality of a hotel. It also has the quality of an office, because they say it's good for business. I mean, you're always working online, but it also has this kind of public quality of like almost the street. You know, it gets like becomes this place that's like open online. You show your house on display. It was just, we started asking ourselves the question of how do we design for this? What kind of space would this be? And yes, I guess.
I wanted to say something just about the show in Venice, because I think all these questions that you know obviously pointed out, it was quite the reason why I felt it was quite powerful, the show. Even though it was a very small show, was the fact that actually all these questions were addressed in a very direct way, even if simply because the show happened in one of these in a series of flats rented through Airbnb. And also another thing that I felt was kind of making all these questions very apparent and not just very abstract was the fact that we paired a number of contemporary artists that really deal actually in their practice with certain questions of the internet, or like the home online, and all these kind of questions. And we found that actually, there was a subtle kind of the subtle curatorial gesture was to kind of pair architects that really didn't have in their practice or in their work, the work that we showed, like it was not really talking about those issues that we were interested in. So in a way, we kind of matched, or we were interested in the proximity between the practice of artists that really were more, we related to more and were had concerns more similar to ours than the architects in a way. And I think that was actually an interesting thing also for us, as we said before, as young practitioners, the fact that like it was, in a way, it's kind of interesting that we couldn't find within the realm of architecture, a kind of
a contemporary discussion around domesticity.
Yeah, exactly.
But also the fact that the art practice, perhaps they have more of the ability to be satisfied with an open question, saying, okay, there is this happening, and we produce. They just put a question in front of you and they just leave it there, rather than I think the architects, architecture projects often have this tendency to offer a solution, and I think putting the two together, we're actually creating an interesting dialogue in that regard.
So in a sense, it's through the project that we define kind of our agency as young architects, because we also, like, as part of the exhibition, we also kind of produced a text that described all these paradigms that we're trying to explore through the exhibition itself, and also have this online presence. So somehow we kind of set up this kind of way of working in a sense.
So, okay, I should say a few words. From Venice on, we kind of discovered, or we kind of found out that this paradigm we took, Airbnb, allowed us to explore many different issues which were actually not satisfied, let's say, in the show we did in Venice. Many of them have already been mentioned. Some of them we will address later. For example, what does it mean that you can monetize extra space in a moment of crisis, for example, such as this is? So we started, in a sense, seeking for opportunities actually to, let's say, to search for further initiatives where we could expand, let's say, on the issues which we are already touched upon in Venice. Some of which happened and are ongoing at the moment, others which probably stopped halfway. But I guess what the interesting point is what before Alessandro was mentioning, that we actually found out that this initiative had an audience. And that this audience was not only, let's say, not only paid attention to what we were doing, but was also inspired. Yeah? And there was a direct, in a sense, feedback which we would get, and which would prove, in a sense, how our own ideas would slowly permeate into the market. So one of the first initiatives we kind of took immediately on board was a panel discussion we organized at the Swiss Institute in New York. In a sense, the subject of this panel is this very interesting anecdote of the foundational myth of Airbnb as a company. I don't know if you're all aware of it, but the company was founded by 3 young graduates from design school who in San Francisco at some point when there was a large design congress, in a sense, had this tremendously innovative idea of doing a bed and breakfast in their living room by just throwing some air mattresses on the floor, yeah? At a moment in which there was a shortage in town of hotel and accommodation. In a sense, this disruptive moment in what was the lobby of hotels in San Francisco escalated into something much larger, which in New York at the moment is a subject which is highly debated. So in a sense, we found it appropriate to, especially because this talk was in New York, to go back to that foundational myth and reconstruct, let's say, what we thought was a latent, somehow, connection between certain conversations which were occurring in the Silicon Valley and with these, let's say, techno hippies, tech hippies in San Francisco, and certain conversations instead which were already part of the architectural discourse since at least the 60s. 2 projects in particular we found particularly inspiring. Both of them somehow came from Banham. Home is not a house, for example, or more generally the use of inflatables, and somehow this idea of the house being something like a kit which you can carry with you, or this idea of nomadic life. And another essay which Banham published for a 1986 Triennale in Milan, of which the title was Chic Nomadism, which we found particularly appropriate also to question, let's say, the value of this connection in contemporary times. So we organized this panel in New York at the Swiss Institute, where we, in a sense, tried to bring these 2 realities together. We invited, on the one hand, 2 directors from Airbnb San Francisco, and I must say that this was the first time, let's say, directors from Airbnb in a sense, manifested themselves, or presented themselves in a public event, in a public cultural event. And on the other hand, we had Branzi as a contributor, and I'm assuming that you all know who Branzi is, of course. The talk was introduced by Alessandro, which was our, let's say, our presence at the Swiss Institute, which gave an introduction, in a sense, dealing with the question of the monetization of the home, and the home, let's say, as a marketable asset, and the implication this has had, let's say, in how we have conceived domesticity pretty much in the last 70, 80 years. Maybe you want to spend a few words on that.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, New York was a very important moment because, I mean, first of all, as Fabrizio said, was the first time the Airbnb has publicly participated into a cultural event, so not a branded event or something they had control over. And that turned out to be quite interesting. And also was quite, I mean, it was interesting in New York also because the community of people that kind of came to see the talk was the community of artists, and in that way there was an interesting exchange because obviously most of these people that came to the talk had a kind of personal investment in this conversation because they all use Airbnb to kind of subsidize their life and their lifestyle. So there was actually a very engaged participation from the audience. Yeah, what my presentation was, so the event was structured, I mean, very simply, I did a presentation, then the 2 Airbnb representatives did a presentation, and then we had Andrea Branzi's video playing, and the overlap of these narratives was quite interesting, and it kind of revealed itself also when we opened up to questions. But my presentation was about, or our presentation was about trying to trace a history of how the house has become a commodity. So like before, how we got to Airbnb basically. So it was kind of starting from the Depression era America, and now the home was made into a currency, all the way down to, in a way, to like 60s kind of hippie mythology and kind of radical design, all the way down to Airbnb. I mean, this. So yeah, then I mean, another thing we did for that talk that is quite interesting. So we used we partnered with Genius, which is, I mean, maybe you know Rap Genius. So it's a website and a company that kind of used to let you annotate only rap songs, or like people could annotate rap songs, but now it's kind of transitioning into this much more ambitious project, which is basically like annotate the internet. That's their kind of claim. So we've been asked by them to kind of, and then they're trying to expand, of course, beyond rap. So, you know, they want to have more kind of cultural content. And we were quite scared in the beginning because we thought like only like rap fans would like annotate this text about Airbnb, which was kind of interesting in a way, but also kind of weird. But then we actually found out that there is a very active community on this website, and it really allowed us to really expand. I mean, what the panel already was, like really, engaging, the response from the public was really strong, but also kind of being able to expand this online. Just to say basically how we're trying to structure our kind of output. So this is kind of part of this strategy in which like we really try to kind of make this, the content and the kind of ideas that we're interested in engaging for people.
So that the conversation doesn't become insular between us and it kind of opens up to everyone else kind of that wants to take part in it. At the same time as this project was kind of evolving, we were also working at the same time on a commission for a group show in Paris, which we kind of, it was the first time that we're commissioned to make an object, which is another thing that we're interested in kind of developing more. So in a sense, it becomes, in the sense that kind of our coming together suddenly has an output that suddenly becomes somehow art-based in a sense. The exhibition was happening at the same time as we're looking at the notion of the kind of genesis or the myth of the genesis of the Airbnb as a company, but at the same time as we kind of are writing this text on the image of the home online. So in a way, this kind of object or intervention was seen as a kind of way to explore these two areas of interest or research that we were doing and have a direct kind of a direct output or kind of a direct kind of installation that could go alongside it. So the object that we made is an Airbnb survival kit, and it basically consists in a kind of air mattress with slippers, a guest book, and towels. The exhibition happened in front of the Picasso Museum in Paris. So we kind of used that references to kind of evolve this towel design in a way. So we've also kind of now going into e-commerce where we're kind of selling this Picasso embroidered towel with the kind of...
This was also a comment on, because this was around the time when the rebranding of Airbnb happened. And there was a lot of, it was kind of like a lot of trolling online on the fact that the logo looks like a vagina. So we kind of, we're interested in the way like this kind of things get communicated online, and now like, it's interesting basically like how the company handles its image online, we thought. So we kind of very kind of directly riffed off of that.
The main focus was the image that we were going to get out of this object in a way, because the way we wanted to frame the next conversation, which is a commission by Rysam to kind of talk about the image of the home online, was through this kind of how is Airbnb changing the kind of the way that the home is represented
Yeah, perhaps we can start actually addressing that very image of the kitchen, which, as real as it seems, is a CGI rendering. So as we see many, for example, in IKEA catalogs online. And as much as we were interested in this, obviously there was a conversation going on in Venice about, let's say, Airbnb, about being one of the largest possibly repositories of interior photography on the planet. And we have to realize that we're talking about a company which has 800,000 listings in 33,000 cities, in 192 countries across the world. So we're talking about more than 1 million photographs of interiors, And this alone is a fact which, in a sense, sets up a space which for architects, I think, is very interesting to question. Even more so since 2010, when the company founded a branch of Airbnb called Airbnb Photography. And the way in which this branch was founded was the following. At the time, they had only around 40 listings in San Francisco, which were going relatively bad. And the founders themselves had the idea of going to New York and photographing these apartments themselves, because they realized that the pictures were quite bad. That was the only kind of recurrent pattern going on. So in fact, this spontaneous aspect of Airbnb, of users having the possibility not only to upload their space and therefore monetize that, but also to, in a sense, upload pictures of their space to represent themselves somehow, was immediately, in a sense, how do you say, tackled by the company as something which had to be fixed. Yeah? And obviously what the company realized is that in order to make these apartments more productive, they needed to refer to a certain way of photographing space. Yeah? So after this brief tour to New York, within a week, the productivity of the company increased by 2.5. So meaning that if they were making, let's say, $200 a week, in 1 week, the week after, they were making more than double the amount of money. So this quite quickly became, let's say, an overarching strategy which the company applied to almost all its listings. Airbnb photography is a free service you can apply for if you, let's say, put your house on Airbnb. And Airbnb hires around 3,000 photographers all around the world to, in a sense, enter within your homes and take the very same pictures, yeah, from the very same points of view, focusing on the very same things. This is an interesting factor which in our text on Rhizome we also tried to show with an image which was made actually by a current student at the second year, where 30 listings of Airbnb are superimposed one on top of each other. And in a sense, what emerges from this image is quite directly how the company curates its portfolio of images. Photographers are hired, they submit a portfolio of images. These images are curated, selected, and in a sense are selected by the affinity they have one to another. So this issue of photography somehow started for us to become extremely important, largely also because of this notion of the repository, yeah? And this huge somehow archive of interiors, which as a user you can browse through. This browsing is the new, in a sense, is the new way you navigate through websites such as Airbnb nowadays. You don't search for something you need. You browse through, in a sense, a series of experiences. And that is why the company now places emphasis even more so on this idea of the experience, yeah, rather than the necessity of being somewhere. So I think what is interesting about this photography is that somehow it shows how, in fact, this space that they are creating around the world, which is self-similar in a sense, with minor alterations in style, is a highly pampered space, to borrow terms from Sloterdijk. Yeah, it's really a large interior where we can feel comfortable, which is morally decent, which is curated, and where there is no space for obscenity. Reason why in the essay we try to tackle also perhaps other ways of seeing the home online, for example, on amateur porn, or even just the casual Skype tour around the house, or Snapchat, for example. Taking it kind of seriously as a phenomenon, as it is. So, in a sense, Rhizome is part of, let's say, a larger, let's say, body of work, which we keep on doing, which is writing text. The first text we wrote was for Fulcrum somehow, yeah, which was in a sense a text which went in parallel to the exhibition in Venice.
I mean, to add something about the image of the home online on this article, I think there's an interesting thing that Airbnb had to do in order to be able to monetize a space that wasn't monetizable before, which is with the house, was to create a common language through photography in order to create a currency. So therefore you can compare everything. You needed an equivalent, a bit like money basically, that allowed to compare things that were incomparable and create a language that allowed to make them, to value them basically, and to sell them. But at the same time, while doing that, they emphasize the special places, like the exotic, the weird, the quirky, and all this type of places as the thing that one is looking for, the experience. And I think that's very, I think it's very interesting to see how it might affect. You know, we can see two types of listing already happening on Airbnb. The very standard one, white, abstract, just like offering a service, you can sleep there and that's it. And then there's the other one, which is more like you go there for a very specific reason to get an experience. And in terms of here we've been talking about four projects. So there's the Airbnb Pavilion, which was an exhibition. There was a talk we wrote a text for Fulcrum with the Pavilion. We did a panel discussion in New York, and there was this thing in Paris, this object we produced, and this text for Rhizome. And really, I think what we're trying to point out is that we whatever format or output that comes to us or we find or we want to explore, we just like try to go for it, and then we try to look into how we can address that with like Airbnb. So we've been like making text, producing images, but we also produced images for artists, for example, for the exhibition. We showed our own work as well as artists and architects in the exhibition, and all this is used also to kind of furnish our social media presence that we always kind of try to bring reference on, like from past historical kind of architects and also stuff we find in everyday life in our street, in our apartment, or just like spending time together or like whatever. So I think it's been quite interesting because there's never been any format in terms of how we would think or how to express what we're interested in, and we're trying to tap into whatever is available. And I think that's interesting.
The next step, considering this call is called What's Next, happens tomorrow actually, where Alessandro and I are flying to Bari in south of Italy, where we have been invited by a gallery to do a performance, and the subject of that performance will be the idea of community. It's interesting because at the same time we were working with this notion of community, which Airbnb recently places so much emphasis on, perhaps to protect itself from, let's say, the threats of municipal bureaucracy. Is that at the same time we were developing this project, actually just 2 or 3 days ago, the first large community meeting occurred in San Francisco, where Airbnb, in a sense, founders opened the doors to the entire community of Airbnb. In a sort of guru-like fashion, they gathered within reconstructed listings and somehow exchanged notes and experiences they had as users or hosts. And this is part of, let's say, a wider objective or a wider, let's say, image the company is trying to give of itself, with slogans like "belong anywhere," or which really, in a sense, push globalization, in a sense, the cliches of globalization to the limit. And so, as much as we do, we try to intervene in these themes, not by writing about them only, or not by reflecting on them, but actually of going on the ground and testing them ourselves. In Venice, the exhibition was not, let's say, an essay about the possibility of doing an exhibition in someone's house without him knowing or her knowing. We actually did it, and we thought that in Bari we would adopt the same scheme. So at the moment we are basically in contact with over 100 Airbnb hosts in Bari, unofficially. So we're using Airbnb's website actually as a way of contacting people, which is something which is rather difficult. Because you cannot talk to Airbnb users if you don't actually make an inquiry to get their room. Yeah. So this is actually something which points out how the relationships which occur within this community are really reliant on financial transactions, and much of this, let's say, this quirkiness is evident in the kind of conversations we're having now with them. Because obviously we are not interested in booking 100 flats in Bari, and there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of why we are contacting people. So the event will take place in a former fascist building, in a large meeting room, where Alessandro and I will, in a sense, continue to dwell along this uncertainty as to whether we are officials from Airbnb or not. So please don't spoil the secret. And this is being live streamed, by the way. And it's going to be live streamed, by the way. Along with the event in Bari, we curated an online exhibition, which is visible on the website of the gallery we are working with, which is 63rd to 77th Step. This is an online exhibition where 4 artists show videos of their work, which tackles directly with the question of the home. And from basically from Thursday onwards, you can visit it.
Yeah, I wanted to say something more maybe about like the community aspect of this project, because in a way I feel like in every project we really approach every project as really in a way as architects. I mean, also because it's the only choice we have really. But you know, I mean, as parallel to like addressing questions of the home, which is obviously kind of the core business of architects in a way, or has been historically. Community is another one, and of course, like much of the 20th century has been kind of about conversation about participation and how like architecture kind of involves, or like as a stake in kind of creating communities, or as agents in that, and how this is kind of now, and in a way Airbnb maybe inadvertently is kind of tackling kind of like acting on all these grounds that traditionally are the grounds of architects. So in a way, the community aspect is another one of these things that really we approach as architects. And I think, just to conclude, I think on what's the direction that we're heading towards now. I think right now we're really interested in kind of thinking of ourselves as, we're interested in interior design and interior decor. As a kind of discipline that has been very marginal in the world of architecture, and kind of that has never been a kind of group or an interior designer that has had a kind of critical practice or kind of a practice of any kind of intellectual relevance. So we found basically like another, I think we're really like interested in basically like finding, in a way we're very kind of startup-y about this, because it's basically interesting to find areas that are kind of, in the shadow, or where there is, where that we can claim basically. We
want to operate between like cross-boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. We want to operate between kind of interior design and art in a way. Also because out of the frustration with kind of architecture in a way, or like architectural practice in a way. Sorry, and so like to do that, we're kind of looking at similar, or like not similar, but like at other practices that we find inspiring in terms of the format. And these would be groups or collectives of people that kind of operate in between different disciplines. And these would be people like Société Réaliste, Benadel Corporation, Meta Heaven, Keho, and Villa Design Group, which are all groups that kind of operate either between graphic design and art, or typography design and art, or Keho is trend forecast, like branding and art, and Villa Design Group also does design and art. So I think we're looking at these kind of practices to kind of find, now to go on with like our projects, to kind of find a format that is viable to do projects in the future. I think we conclude here. Thank you. Thank you.
We can open up for questions.
If there is any question, we're happy to answer. Yeah.
Yes.
Jack, please.
Jack.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Of course, I have appreciated your work for a long time, and it was great to see you present what I've seen previously as disparate projects underneath a single kind of driving ideology. I wanted to pick up on something that Octave mentioned, which is really has to do with, you very much insist on the fact that you're operating in this as architects. And one of the questions which has always been present for me is, in a condition in which we have the decline of the nation state, we have the decline of the civic realm, and therefore we really, I think it's increasingly the case that we need to have truly public space. And what your, let's say, focus shows, which is the often neglected flip side of that, which is the end of private space as well. Which leads to this kind of smooth neoliberal space. And so I guess my question is, what the role of the architect can be, and what types of space. Is this, for example, the future of the architect as a kind of designer of urban infrastructure, or what your sort of ideas about that type of space might be?
Yeah. I don't know if I could claim that what we kind of look at is a smooth neoliberal space. I think it's a bit of always struggle with that description of like contemporary space. I think it's still like a very uneven and contradicting space. And maybe in the case of Airbnb, one of the examples would be that, okay, you have millions of rooms that are documented online, but it's not all rooms, and perhaps it kind of widens the gap of what is referenced and what is not. And so already that's like something that's, I mean, I don't really know how it would influence design, but I think it already changes, like, you know, space is not that uniform. I think two rooms have different qualities in that sense. I mean, I don't know, for example, there's another aspect in the way, I mean, you just mentioned infrastructure, architectural infrastructure. If we are like architects in the sense we design that, I think there's there's something I'm fascinated with, and I don't really know how to address it yet, but how, for example, since modernism, the way space has been produced has been very much, you define a subject, you define a function that the subject does, and you produce a space like in a very causal kind of manner. And you say this space has this function, it serves this thing. Even like for emancipatory reason or something like this, you know, like from like the most practical to the most like utopian, let's say. And all of a sudden now we see that, you know, through this platform like Airbnb, you can give a new function, or actually you design a space and it has nothing to do. You know, you can just you can repurpose something without changing it. And I think it's like questions, it brings like the production of space, of architecture into, it brings a new light on it in the sense that actually maybe what would come would be just this production of space, and you produce this kind of anonymous or like abstract spaces, or maybe not so abstract spaces that have very specific qualities on their reference online, for certain reasons, for perhaps like architectonic qualities such as light, ceiling height, or I don't know, accessibility or something like this. All of a sudden, you just go there just whenever you need it, instead of having like one of these kind of typical open, you know, like the promise of the open plan was that you can have any use within one space, and all of a sudden now you might have a bunch of very specific spaces spread across the city, and you just use the space whenever you need it. For example, this is something I don't really know where it goes in terms of design, and you can I think it's very full of problems as well, but I think that's how I think, I don't know, and architecturally I think that's what would interest me.
But this is also something super problematic. For example, when we hear people like Chesky, one of the founders of Airbnb, talking about property today being a burden, we have to kind of emphasize the fact that this is a highly, in a sense, elitarian way of tackling the question, which deals with cliches, which are almost not even worth mentioning somehow. So in a sense, I think the question now is whether we talk about, let's say, architecture literally, so in terms of bricks and mortar and space, or whether we address questions like which deal with policies and polity in general, and how, as communities, for example, we want to deal with these questions, and how we want to deal with, for example, questions such as a corporation. Such as Airbnb, which is ubiquitous, but at the same time brings taxes only in the US. And how this is somehow, in a sense, disruptive in, let's say, making us re-question ever-existing lobbies such as that of the hotel industry, or in the case of Uber, for example, of taxi driving and licenses in general. So I guess there are two levels in that respect. When it comes to the home, as Los used to say, you're always right. When it comes to the home, what we are trying to develop now is something which has less to do with, in a sense, an infrastructural, I would say, aspect, and much more to do with a certain tactile and soft and much more rapid, let's say, aspect to control. This has to do with agency again, because architecture as a practice has become increasingly slow, I think. And in a sense, the only way to try to find some sort of momentum in what we do and not get depressed is to, in a sense, try to tackle or try to address niches where actually we do have opportunities, and where, let's say, the market, let's say, allows us to operate at a certain speed. for instance.
I think, I mean, just in a very banal way, I think the thing about agencies, architects, blah, 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 I think with Airbnb was the fact that I think we are interested in really trying to understand what like the space of the home is today. Like very simply, like the fact that we find this important because I think like as architects we kind of need to know or like need to understand what what are the contemporary changes to that space are. And I think that we don't see that there is so much, I mean, this doesn't seem to be a huge preoccupation, you know, in general. So like we kind of feel the urgency in kind of trying to understand that, I think.
And with that, I'd like to add just a very quick comment before I pass it on to someone else, which is that I think to draw together what all three of you have just said now, you're absolutely right that in a sense, you know, capitalism creates subjectivities precisely in order to mobilize a particular population into the capitalist process. And what is so interesting about the work that you're doing and what is really unique amongst architects today is that you're looking for moments of rupture, of possible rupture within subjectivity, and you've found a very specific and very interesting moment at which you, through very simple means, you can have very big impacts on the individual's relationship to space and their autonomy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there any other question?
You seem to be doing a better job than the Airbnb's marketing team. Collaborated with them yet, have you?
No way. I mean, it's fine that you say that because they also think the same way as you do. They told us.
Concerns about that, and would you ever collaborate with them?
Well, initially the project was developed to be working with them in partnership. So the kind of initial idea was for us to have a pavilion that they were going to be fully invested in.
I mean, not like that arised as a possibility to
Exactly.
have them funding it.
Yeah.
But basically, I mean, then in a way that I don't think we were ever interested in kind of working for them. Absolutely not. We were interested in kind of working with them just to kind of foster the project, like in a way, kind of see what the interaction with them was important.
Be closer to the topic as well,
exactly.
I think. Because I think their discourse on the way they formulate what they are doing is, I mean, the rhetoric of the Silicon Valley on like what they're proposing is actually, I mean, I don't know.
Because I mean, I think in general it's very hard in general terms to kind of, there are all these kind of, I mean, for example, the Silicon Valley companies that have such a big impact on everyone's life, but it's kind of hard to have them participate in a cultural discussion, like this as the completely parallel thing. So we try to kind of engage them directly in that sense to bring them onto our plane,
But
in a way.
we also have to say that they're quite unaware of what they are doing. They really evolve in a sphere which is like the West Coast American privilege, tech guys drinking lattes type of vibe, you know. And I don't know, because we invited them to the New York talk, to the Swiss Pavilion and to the Swiss Institute, and really the most interesting thing that they brought was actually the fact that they couldn't really create a debate, you know. It was the fact that their answers were completely missing the point, where you were trying to frame Airbnb within an historical, political frame, you know, even like an attempt at doing something like that. They were just like completely unable to relate even to things like Super Studio, like when they were supposed to be architects. So it's just like, okay.
I think, I mean, in general, I think it's interesting that in the discussion about how these private companies now kind of hold the mean to our life and to such a great extent, but at the same time they're not able to formulate that impact kind of ethically or in any way. I think that's interesting. But in terms of us doing their marketing, I think like the format that we use is always kind of playing with that a little bit, just because we find it's a kind of interesting way of operating, but we're not trying to. I mean, we try to kind of like, also use irony in a way, like to kind of uncover certain dynamics that they use. But it's true. I mean, they also told us that we were doing marketing better than them, and also they also told us, what did they say? That they felt questioned by us if they're leaders or followers. which was another one of these kind of
It
exchanges
was a
with them.
huge kind of like
Yeah, the-
inter-company conversation.
Exactly.
Where, like,
Before
there were
decide-
two camps basically, one that wanted to kind of give us financial support, one that didn't. And in a sense, the two camps were like this, the basic fact that we're not funding this is a kind of, proves our cultural irrelevance.
But the interesting thing about, let's say, the company itself is that even there are two scales at which it operates and two scales at which we've had a relationship. There is the guys in San Francisco, of course, which we can quite easily say that they were quite cool with what we were doing, as long as it didn't, let's say, disrupt their own activities or cross over their territory. But then there were the guys in Italy, of Airbnb Italy, which is an office of 6-7 people, which were very concerned instead of what we were doing. And there is where you can test actually what let's say, a company like Airbnb does to certain, let's say, contexts. For instance, it was not accidental that they were particularly concerned of what we were doing because we were in Venice. If you imagine that Venice, being an island, has a highly controlled, or used to have a highly controlled way of managing the amount of, let's say, guests which could come on the island by means of how many places were available in hotels at that time. And now if you imagine a scenario where every second, let's say, or every third apartment in Venice can be rented, obviously we are dealing with issues which can be extremely, with which, let's say, the company has to be extremely careful because they can be extremely disruptive, let's say, in creating very high, let's say, imbalances within the management of the city.
Hi, yeah, thanks for a great talk. It was wonderful. I was wondering if you could sort of, two things. First, sort of how you think, in terms of sort of physical manifestation, the sort of neoliberal requirement for one to be sort of both liquid and authentic, like in terms of a user of Airbnb wanting to bring in as much income through their apartment. Like, is there a trend for what you see that, like, the biggest driver of that is like a apartment which is flexible and can be sort of like retrofitted to any desire, and also authentic sort of space in a location?
Can I take this?
Yeah.
First of all, there are instructions on the website on how to better market your home. And it's a quite interesting document you can consult. In case, I don't know if you're asking out of curiosity or let's say, or if you're after practical advice. But that's definitely let's say something to have a look at. On the other hand, even within Airbnb, it's hard to generalize as everything, because obviously there are many different types of users, as there are also many different types of hosts. I think in terms of, if we talk about, let's say, an average user, which is a middle to low class, let's say city dweller, there are obviously recurrent patterns which come about again and again. And those are we kind of touch on those patterns both in Fulcrum and in the Rhizome essay, probably more extensively.
There was also this thing that we talked about in New York, the fact that like the home, even for the home to be commoditized and kind of become far more currency, it kind of also needs to become more of itself, like more, the home needs to look more homey in a way. So I think that was an interesting thing that we found out, like the fact that, contrary to kind of the real estate market, for example, where you have pictures of, or like the home is always presented, houses are always presented as kind of empty so that people can project their own life. In this case, it's really about like, for example, they really suggest to put a cat in the house to kind of look more kind of,
domestic.
There are people who hate cats, so I don't know how that works, but like a cat or kind of blankets or kind of all kind of surface, like soft surfaces and kind of graphic elements.
You're buying into the space with the persona as well, somehow attached to that kind of interior decoration somehow.
And in terms of the users, maybe, you said it's hard to generalize, and I also feel a bit like in different ways regarding that, because some people just use it to make money or to, they have 5 apartments and they just rent it. Some others you know, they just use it to travel on it, whatever. But you also have, I think it can be interesting, for example, the single mom 50 would just want to, you know, have people around because she's like constantly alone. I think that there all of a sudden you have like the possibility to have something happening. And I don't know, I think it's, I mean,
no, but it's in that respect, for example, it's also interesting when you browse, let's say, through how users, let's say, market their home and what they can offer, no? And you have many different ways of tackling the question. One recently, for example, I have seen yesterday, is a man that refused to put any photograph of his house and actually put only photographs of the city, no? And of let's say, cultural issues which he found interesting and which he would, let's say, show within the city, which is again one of the big topics Airbnb is going now. And in fact, it's quite interesting to question, for example, or to see vis-a-vis other services which are emerging as a website called Viable, where, for instance, anyone can offer, let's say, tours or experiences and operate, let's say, as guides within a city and put their experience, market their experience online. So as much as, for example, at Airbnb, there is this website where, for example, you can say, I'm Fabrizio, I'm an architect, I have a certain kind of interest in the city, and if you give me £70, I will dedicate 3 hours of my life in showing you, let's say, Hawksmoor or other kinds of things in the city. And it's all, obviously, it all is part of this, let's say, overarching community which Airbnb refers to, but at the same time, it's highly problematic when we think of hospitality, for example, as a subject, because everything is dependent on financial transaction, and therefore it's a service in a sense.
Yeah, like there's always this emphasis on like the community, but somehow like Airbnb as a company is not aware that the transaction, or is very much aware of this transaction, but it doesn't market it as a transaction itself. So they kind of celebrate this idea of like niceness of the host showing you around the city, but they never mention the fact that this only happens through a financial.
And this is the genius of Airbnb.
Yeah.
They just basically take care of the money, so you never see it, and that's how it started. You know, that's the main idea at the center of it. On all the sharing economy website, that's what they do. They're a marketplace that just secure money exchange, and they also make it invisible.
Yeah. But it also shows how the house can be actually a very political, let's say, subject of debate, which is an issue which we are trying to explore also in, let's say, other types of, let's say, homes, which have some kind of political relevance. This, for example, was, what was it, 2 days ago?
It's 2 days ago. It's the house that the Mexican president was designing for himself with like dirty money. So somehow using the kind of home as a way to explain, or kind of interior decoration that explains somehow political paradigm.
And this was also one of those images which sparked some of the, let's say, the turmoils which occurred in Mexico recently, for example.
And there's one last thing really quickly, and I guess this is a sort of area or sort of a question which we sort of cover your whole sort of investigation as a project or as a team or whatever, but whether you had any thoughts at this stage on, so once the interior is put to work for you and sort of ironically can sort of be put to work to pay off the debt which sort of facilitated the house which is in, sort of, and although it's not the first time, sort of these sort of neoliberal tentacles have sort of encroached upon the interior.
We can't hear.
Can you put the microphone away from your phone?
And although it's not the first time that these sort of neoliberal tentacles have encroached upon the interior, how do you think at your current stage it will affect notions of dwelling and domesticity in terms of, do you think they will stay inside the interior of the home and just morph, or do you think they will be sort of transplanted or like away from the home and move elsewhere as like a haven, or as like a safe place to sort of go and sort of protect yourself against these sort of
I mean, I think we missed part of the question, but I mean, I think it's interesting what you're saying about like if domesticity or kind of has to leave the home because the home is not a safe space anymore for kind of the development of affects and kind of because it has to become public in a way, it has to become kind of marketable. If it will kind of inhabit another space, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, it's something to definitely is interesting to think about.
Yeah. I mean, what do you mean by dwelling on authenticity?
Oh no, sorry.
Like, I don't know. It's.
I'm the authentic part in the first question, but so that wasn't in this.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood everything.
But just in that, because obviously, sort of the home as a fortress and all those cliches.
Yeah.
Once you are looking upon the interior not as a sort of safeguard from the outside world, but as a sort of way to sort of produce an income.
I mean, I don't know. I find it always problematic to say, okay, the internet arrived, and all of a sudden everything changed, and it broke the walls, it opened the house, it's public. I don't think it's true, and also I don't think that the home was the fortress of the family or heaven. For example, the feminist critique is the famous one: is reproductive labor, happens within the home. This has been going on. I don't know, it's never been that clear. I don't know where.
I wasn't saying it was the first time ever, and obviously it's been encroached on before.
I'm saying that just it's questions that are ongoing and they've been opened for a while, and it's true that it affects something, but I don't know if we can say that, all of a sudden all houses are public, all houses are monetizable, all houses are, I don't know, I think it's more or less, I don't know, it's very much in the continuity of changes.
Also, I think all the cliches kind of reinforce each other. As we said, the home to function as a marketable asset needs to also become more domestic or produce that image. And this was, as I mentioned before, in New York, we talked about how during the Depression era, when there was this housing crisis, the mortgages, the New Deal kind of maybe transformed the home into this kind of currency. And now the only way to do that, so at the same time while houses were becoming a currency, so something abstract and liquid on the market, at the same time to be marketable, they had to really be lived as homes. So I think these kind of cliches or these kind of different aspects of the house, I don't think this will ever transform, because in a way all these things are interlocked. To be able to function, I think all these aspects need to really are really interlocked. So I don't see that really changing so much.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.